All right. Can you guys hear me? So if somebody does win the raffle, could we do Google and Google Groups?
Yes, we can do.
Skype drives me crazy for some reason. I don't know why. Hey, I'm Eric, and I've been in jury duty for the past 2 weeks. So I've been listening to people talk about stuff I really don't care about. So I haven't been able to sculpt. So I'm going to do a lot of sculpting today, and probably not as much talking. I'm just going to kind of goof around and wing it. And, you know, everything that, you know, Ara was talking about and Steve been talking about is very important. But I'm also good. There's nothing wrong with going on the opposite end of the spectrum. And by that, what I mean by that is sometimes just sculpt some stuff. And don't worry about what it is, and don't even think about what it is, and just see where it takes you. I think it's important, it's the yin-yang thing. I'm going to sound very Californian here, but it's the yin-yang thing where you've got to kind of start to turn off that technical side of your brain and just see what ZBrush can do. And I'm not a particularly good musician, but I was trained as a musician, so that's kind of how I think. And sometimes when I'm working with ZBrush, I like to think about it if you're practicing, like, you know, licks on the guitar or something like that. Sometimes you just got to sit there and just pound out some goofy blues licks 1,000 times so that on the off chance you actually are playing with a bunch of people or something like that, you don't have to think about every single thing you're doing. You build up some muscle memory. So one of the things that I've been doing lately, especially, so I teach the digital creature sculpting class here at Gnomon on Sunday nights. It's a fun class. But what I started doing with the class is the first 30 minutes of class, I have everyone just load up like a Polysphere or Dynamesh or something like that, and for 30 minutes just hammer away at it without any idea of anything in particular that they want to create. In fact, you kind of want to, every time you start to see yourself or think of yourself as trying to make something, push that thought out of your head and just mess around with it. And the reason this is very useful is it's because it's like hammering out those blues licks or those jazz licks or whatever else on the guitar, you're building up kind of a muscle memory so that when you are in a situation where you have to sculpt something quickly, like in a studio or something like that, you already have kind of a catalog of things in your brain that you can work with. So that's kind of what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to kind of do the typical thing that I do, which is I usually start with maybe a sphere or something like that. And I like Dynamesh a lot. I tend to, these days, my workflow is kind of the opposite. I start with the forms in a very sloppy, rough method. And if they turn into something that's worthwhile, or even if I'm trying to do something like an insect anatomy or a spider or something like that, I'll do it all as one big kind of blob, and I'll worry about the topology later. And personally, I will use Dynamesh for some things, and then a lot of times I'll take stuff into Maya and actually do a retopology using the modeling toolkit. But, you know, there's some cool stuff that you can discover, and I'm going to just drive Ara crazy. Let's start with this polysphere with this horrible, horrible pole on there, and let's do things that are wrong and just see what happens. Because you can start to discover some cool things. So I'm just going into the initialize. This is still a parametric 3D object, and I'm just going to pick kind of maybe like a low polygon count here, maybe something like 20 by 36, I don't know, something like that's cool. And then I'm just going to hit, you know, make polymesh. So now it's a polymesh 3D. And then what I'm going to do is let's fool around with this. Let's go into Dynamesh and let's see how 128 looks. I'm going to undo that, maybe get it up to let's try 256. So I'm going to hit 256. You notice that, you know, I've got actually a fair amount of geometry here, but, you know, I've also got kind of this faceting that's come through from the original low poly model. And there's like some really cool accidental stuff that you can do with this. I'm always a big fan of, like, you know, happy accidents. Like you know, Neville Page likes to do and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to get some symmetry going here, because we all love bilateral symmetry. That's where we came from. It's been a big hit for most life forms since the Precambrian. Very, very successful. We don't need those people with the radial symmetry. here's an interesting thing. So basically if you've ever happened, for those of you who are new to ZBrush, if you ever have something like this happen, like I'm holding the shift key to try and smooth it, but what it's actually doing is it's doing the opposite of smoothing. Let's see if I can get this to work here. It looks like, there we go. It's still acting annoying. So let's see if I do this. Yeah, for some reason, there's a weird bug where every once in a while the smooth brush does the opposite of what it's supposed to do. So I just had to turn it on to Z sub to get it to actually smooth. When you see it doing like, this kind of thing, it's actually doing the opposite of smoothing, which is sharpening, which is really strange, but it's just a weird little bug. But let's just play with some stuff. Get out my favorite brush, which is the Damien standard brush, and make sure that I still got my symmetry here, and I'm just gonna start by, doing some weird stuff here and getting some marks onto the page, sort of the Jackson Pollock style of sculpting. I don't know what that means. So I've kind of been, the one thing I need to warn you guys about is that when you're working with symmetry and in ZBrush, the accidentally making pornographic images is really easy, so I'm not doing anything intentionally. I apologize ahead of time. So if you see something horrible start to emerge on my sphere, just hide your children or something, I don't know. But there's some, really interesting things that you can do when you're just fooling around. I'm kind of like, you guys, for those who know me, probably know I'm a huge biology nerd. I love insects particularly, and that's something that I've been focusing on. When I first got into doing CG, I was doing it professionally for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which is actually a real place, started by Howard Hughes, and I did a lot of biology animations for them. And so that's kind of why I'm such a big science nerd. That's why I got into it. So I really got into doing insects for a long time, and that's something I still love doing, spiders and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to lower my Z intensity here. There we go. Yeah, ZBrush is acting kind of funky. What I can do, I'm going to try this. Go into brushes, reset all brushes. Why is my, I'm going to go back to, I know what I'm doing, I swear. I'm going to restart ZBrush. It's, for some reason, it's in opposite mode. So, okay, what was I rambling about? Yeah, so, but recently I've been rediscovering sort of a love of good old Geiger. You guys know him as the crazy guy who did all the alien stuff. I actually got into Geiger when I was way too young for it, back when the original Alien came out. And I don't profess to be any kind of expert on his stuff, but I've kind of been enjoying getting back into his stuff recently. So this is a piece that I started working on last weekend, just kind of like this crazy sort of, I guess I'm also a big Trekkie, so this started out as a kind of an homage to Geiger, and now it's turned into kind of like a Borg Queen Geiger style in a way. So I do want to kind of talk about some of the things, the techniques that I used for making this. And let's go into preferences, initialize, whoops, I'm going to do preferences, config, there we go. And let's just go back into Dynamesh. And my basic material. Yes? I'm sorry, what? I have to tell a story? All right. Thank you. So I taught ZBrush here for 8 years, so I appreciate that. Leave me alone. Let's get rid of this goofy brush here. Yeah, so one of the things that I like to do when I'm working in Dynamesh here, or whatever, is I like to get some of this faceting and kind of start to play with it a little bit. So I'm going to up the resolution here to 256. And so this kind of like cool kind of grid work is something that you can actually turn into a detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of making some little blobos here. And then I'm going to go into geometry, clay polish, And I'm going to hit the clay polish button. And the cool thing about the clay polish button is it does clean up this geometry and smooth things out really quickly. But it also, if you can see, it leaves this very thin mask here on the edges. You can control the amount of masking if you want, but I'm just going to leave it at the default. And then I'm just going to do Control-I to invert it, and then Control-H to hide the mask. So then what I can do is I can come in here and start to use this kind of grid work pattern as kind of like a cool, you know, mesh-like cyber or whatever detail. And I do this a lot. I probably do it too much. It's one of those tricks that I like to throw out whenever I'm kind of looking for some cool ideas. And so I'm just kind of messing with this kind of thing. And I'm going to clear the mask. And let's get the Damien standard brush again. And there's some other cool things you can do with the brushes that are just kind of fun to play with. One of them, especially with the Damien standard brush, it's such a wonderful all-purpose brush, but it's great for creating straight lines and that kind of stuff. Well, one trick you can do is you can go into the brush palette and under orientation, turn up the spin rate a little bit and then the spin center. And what that does is it's going to spin the alpha around while you draw, but it's also the spin center is going to offset it. So what you do is if you play with this, you can get, turn up the spin rate a little bit, you can get this kind of like wobbliness, and you can even make it look kind of like curly cues. Let me make sure lazy mouse is on for a second. Make sure it's not, there we go. It's a little extreme, but you can get some kind of cool details here. And this is also cool for doing like a kind of like a modeled kind of zombie skin kind of thing. As you overlap the strokes, you can get some really interesting details in here. I'm going to turn down the spin center a little bit. So it's just a little bit more subtle. So if we're doing organic stuff, you can get some really interesting effects that way. And again, so sometimes I'll just bash out some of these wild details, and it looks like garbage, but that's okay. Since I'm an organic modeler, I can afford to be nice and sloppy. And then maybe I'll hit it with that clay polish again, invert that mask, hit Control-H. And the other brush that I like to use a lot is the Form Soft brush. It's kind of like a kinder, gentler version of the inflate brush. And you can get some of these really cool details that look like random, you know, markings at first can start to look like some really interesting kind of biological kind of surfaces. So I'm just inflating it out and then hitting it with the smooth brush right afterwards to get this kind of nice kind of look to it. Maybe I'll do that for a little bit. Control-Drag to clear the mask. Go up to Dynamesh. We're at 185,000. That's nothing. So let's go to 512 on the Dynamesh resolution. Re-Dynamesh. So now we're up to like 900,000. That's still not much, but it's good enough. Another brush that I like to use that I've been playing with is, I love the spiral brush. You know, it has this effect of, I usually turn the Z intensity down because it is kind of an intense brush. But you know, it twists the mesh around. Well, that's pretty cool. You get kind of this Baroque kind of quality to it. But if you start to mess with it, like maybe throw on an alpha, even just a simple alpha like the circle, and maybe like a spray, it's brush stroke, you can get this, and then I'm going to bring up the Z intensity here. This is great, especially if you're doing some kind of like weird zombie skin thing, or you're just messing around. So the cool thing about this spiral brush is the more you draw, the more it kind of wiggles around. So you get this kind of really wild, psychedelic, zombie kind of thing going, and it's fun to play with different alphas and see what you get out of it. So again, okay, so I've got this spherical mess here. That's cool. Let's play with a little bit of the clip rect brush. So I'm just going to clip off the sides here and maybe re-Dynamesh. And then the next thing that I'll usually do, and so usually in the mornings when I get an opportunity, I will do this exercise where I'll just set my clock for 30 minutes, and I will do this for 30 minutes, put on some groovy music or whatever, and this is the same thing I have my class do. So the first 30 minutes of class, everybody sits there and they silently sculpt for 30 minutes. The goal is not to make anything, it's not to make a face, it's not even to worry about whether or not what you're making is good or bad, or what the person next to you is doing, or what somebody you saw online. The more you can push out of your mind that whole idea of trying to be good or bad or great or whatever, the more you can discover. I'm going to start sounding like Yoda here in a second, but you got to unlearn what you learned. You got to take some time to just screw around and not worry about sucking. Because it's that whole ego thing that starts to mess with our heads, and once we start getting caught up in what we're trying to do, we realize that all of our artwork might be good, but it starts to all look the same after a while. So you got to stop trying stuff and just start doing stuff. Yeah, I know, I sound like Yoda, whatever. So all right, what's the big deal? We got this kind of thing here. Another way you can improvise is I'm going to just append a sphere here, and let's scale it down. And so this is another way you can use a live Boolean, is you can actually use it as a where's the live Boolean mem? It's down here, isn't it? Say that again. It's under render. Yeah, that's weird. Yeah, so if I put a Boolean here, and then maybe take the move brush, and I'm going to turn on symmetry for this model as well, you can start to kind of use this. So I'm editing this sphere right here, but since I have it on a negative Boolean, I'm kind of improvising another way of creating this shape, playing around with sculpting the interior shape that is the subtractor rather than the positive mesh. And doing this, you can start to get some really cool ideas going, right? And then when you're happy with it, you can go down and say make Boolean mesh. And I'm not even going to worry too much about the geometry in this Boolean mesh. Let's just go back and make sure that I'm going to make sure that Dynamesh is on. Let's actually set this to not that high. Let's do 512 again. Whoa. So when that happens, is basically it's having a hard time solving the Boolean mesh. So I'm going to undo this. A few things you can try doing it. You can try lowering the resolution of the Dynamesh and then re-Dynameshing, or sometimes you can go in and just see if you have some geometry that's kind of gotten crinkly and folded on itself, and if that happens, you can just try and smooth it out and then re-Dynamesh, and that usually fixes the problem. But if I do something like this, then let's just play with it a little bit more, and then the next thing I usually like to do when I'm improvising is get into the array mesh settings, because that's when you get some really cool stuff going. All right, so it looks like some kind of bizarro waffle cone or something like that. Let's move this up a little bit. So I'm going to go into array mesh and just turn on array mesh and maybe set it to something like 5. I like odd numbers. And then maybe do the Y offset right here. And it's like some of what I like to do, I think that Geiger was probably the first ZBrush artist before there was ZBrush. But a lot of these sort of repeating forms, especially in these rib cages and this kind of stuff, this is where the array mesh, you really start to get some of these ideas going when you're playing with it. Like this kind of stuff. So the idea, for those of you who haven't used array mesh before, all of these controls right here determine how it's making these copies. At the moment, these copies are instances, so it's not actually geometry. But you can sit here and just play with this stuff, and I try not to go too crazy because I am going to convert it into a mesh, and then we'll get kind of heavy. So, and you can actually layer and make multiple layers of array mesh, but I'm improvising. I just kind of want to keep it simple and just explore some forms. So if I change the mode here to scale, then I have my controls for X, Y, and Z, the amount of scaling. And then what's really cool is, of course, underneath the amount sliders, I also have these graphs that I can use to kind of change the way it's scaled, right? So if I look at the profile here, as you can see, if I increase the number of repeats, you can see that we're already starting to get something really Geigerish. That's a new word, I guess. And again, maybe reduce it just a little bit. So I'm playing with scale and offset. We also have rotate, which is a lot of fun to play with. We want to get some kind of cool spiral motion going. And then, of course, we also have the pivot, so we can kind of adjust the pivot. There's also, if you go into Lightbox, there's a lot of presets that you can use under Array. But for me, if I'm just fooling around, I just want to turn off the brain and just see what I come up with. So let's set this down to maybe, I don't know, 6 or something like that. And then I'm going to go down here and turn on Make Mesh. I'm going to turn off Extrude. This is the point that can be a little nerve-wracking because you can make a really heavy mesh. It takes a while, and it will sometimes crash. So that's why you don't want to be too attached to what you're making. That's the other advantage to improvisation. If things crash and go away, you just sort of accept it and move on. So I got this kind of cool little shape here that might be some kind of cool detail. I can go into geometry and under modified topology. It's fun to play with mirror and weld. If I hit mirror and weld, this is currently set to X. So it's mirroring across the X axis, which isn't really doing a whole lot for us because it's mirroring from this axis over to here, right? So it's going from this side to this side, which means if I do a mirror on the X axis, I'm mirroring nothing over to this side. So I want to mirror this side over to this side. So one thing you can do is go under deformation, and if I hit mirror, that will just flip it over. Go back to mirror and weld. There we go. So now you can see we're getting something that's kind of cool. It's 5 million polygons, which is not too bad, but if I'm fooling around, I don't want to worry too much about things getting too heavy. So I might go down to Dynamesh and say, let's lower this to, I don't know, 128. Actually, let's do 256. Control drag to re-Dynamesh. Hope it doesn't freak out. Didn't freak out. Yay, that's cool. You guys feel free to ask me questions if you want to. I'm just making stuff up as I go along. And you can shout stuff out because I'm looking at the screen. I can't see anybody if they raise their hand. So I'm going to do the clay polish again, invert that. Oops. Invert that. Control H hides the mask. I like to hide the mask when I'm working just so I can concentrate on the forms. So this is the kind of cool stuff that you can get going here. You know, and it's just like laying down paint on the canvas, so I'm just going to do this a bit, and like this kind of branching stuff is really cool. And then I'm going to clear the mask, get the old Damien standard brush again, and let's set this spin down to 0. Turn on lazy mouse, and just start to kind of play with this. And so what I do is like, I just kind of, sometimes if these things are good, I'll save them. Sometimes, I'll just, if they're not, I won't. But I've kind of amassed a little bit of a library on my hard drive of these types of things. And I just kind of grabbed some at random from home, but I have a few dozen. So I have Z tools here. So I usually call them something ridiculous. I like Gorbachump. I thought that was a cool name. I don't know what it means, but. So some of these things are more detailed. Some of them are less detailed. If I have bubble guts, I don't know what that is, but it sounds hysterical. Okay, so checking out my time here. So I want to show another thing that you can use, which is some of the techniques I used on this one, which is kind of building on the same idea. Again, it's just all about improvisation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about multi-alpha brushes. So that's a new feature in ZBrush 4R8. It's one of my favorite features. I've just started getting into it. So this is another great warm-up exercise that you can do. So I'm just using the plain 3D here, just the primitive. And under initialize, I don't know, I'm going to set this to like 100 by 100, and then do make polymesh. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a multi-alpha brush, and this uses vector displacement maps so that I can take the detail that I sculpt into this plane and turn it into an alpha, but a really cool alpha that includes things like undercuts. So a lot of these repeated structures here, these kind of random things, are all made with this special type of alpha. And they're kind of similar to using like an insert mesh brush, in that you can make one brush that has a whole bunch of them and then just load that brush up whenever you need it. So I have this, it's at 10,000 points right now. I'm going to turn off smooth and hit divide a few times. So I guess there's a couple rules. I'm just starting to learn this technique, so hopefully I'm correct in this. But essentially the main rule that you have to follow is that the geometry used has to be a flat plane, and it has to have the polygons laid out as a grid. So in other words, I don't want to dynamesh this. I'm going to keep it just as a grid. But I'm going to subdivide it so that the highest subdivision level, it's at like 2 million polygons or something like that, which should be sufficient. And then let's have some fun with some symmetry, maybe radial symmetry. I'll set this to something like 5 or something like that. And again, just start to kind of play with some ideas here. So Damien standard brush, I'm just going to start to pull out this kind of thing. And again, I always like to use the clay polish. It's my latest addiction, just because you can get these kind of cool, bubbly kind of weirdness. This kind of weird, gritty detail. It's a lot of fun. And some of this kind of cool grid stuff, that looks like an artifact. It is an artifact, but it's a cool artifact. I kind of like it, so I kind of want to keep it. So, I might spend 10 minutes on one of these. I might spend an hour or whatever. It seems to make the most sense. I'm going to clear that mask. Of course, the more you pull this out, the more of a form that you create, the more interesting your alpha is going to be, especially if you have things that have kind of undercuts. In other words, true three-dimensional geometry. And like nooks and crannies and that kind of stuff. It's the English muffin approach, I guess. I don't know.
How did you get those smaller details when you're using the clay brush?
You mean like these things?
No, these that are on that artifact.
Oh, like this stuff? Oh, these things? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. No, basically, a lot of it is just kind of like going in here and, hitting it with like Damien standard brush and this kind of stuff, right? Which I've done before, obviously. And then as you do that kind of clay polish thing, it cleans it up. It leaves that sort of hairline mask. So I'm going to invert that mask, hide the mask. You could also, if you want a more straightforward approach, might be just to use mask by cavity or mask by smoothness or the other types of masks. But basically, that mask is still there, and I'm just using the inflate brush to inflate it and then hitting it with the smooth brush. So it's just kind of like inflate and smooth over and over again. And sometimes these little teeny weeny, barely visible artifacts, as you inflate them with that mask on there, are going to start to produce that kind of overlap that you get these kind of cool, kind of organic folds in the surface. And usually I haven't, if I was going to turn this into like a displacement map or something like that to render in another piece of software, that would probably be a problem. But since I'm going to convert this into an alpha, I haven't noticed that kind of overlapping fold has become a problem. And you'll see when I actually convert it into an alpha. I haven't noticed that yet. It might be just that I've been lucky that I haven't seen it. But for the most part, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool. So, when you start to abuse a technique too much, it starts to become a cliche in your own work, and you start to run out, you get stale on it. So in addition to the clay polish, sometimes it's cool to go down here and experiment with like masking by smoothness or that kind of stuff, just so you get like a different type of mask and a different type of detail. Looks like those little itty-bitty mini corn things or something, I don't know. So that's something that's kind of cool to play with. And what I'll do is I'm going to take this subtool and duplicate it. So I have this one right here, and I have this one. I still have, I can't want to say construction history, sorry, that's very Maya. I still have the tool history on here, so I might go back a bit. I could even go back all the way and just make another one, and just keep doing this kind of thing. And build up a tool that has a whole bunch of different brushes. And I'll usually save this out as a tool, right? So in other words, I have a few right here that I've made before. Again, this is just, no, I don't want to save it. Hold on, I want to load it. Yeah, so if I turn on the solo button, you can see that, after just playing around for like an hour or so, you can get some of these really cool designs here. And then what you can do is to make this into an actual alpha brush, you just go up here to the alpha. From what I've seen, I believe this is the correct way to do it, but again, I'm kind of new to this technique. I'm just going to load in the Chisel 3D brush right here, which is kind of the pre-made alpha brush. And when that's loaded, I'm going to go brush, create multi-alpha brush. And take a few seconds. By the way, Ara, I apologize for being snippy with you. It's the jury duty, man. It's been getting to me. Can't these people solve their own problems? Anyways, so you can see now I have this multi-alpha brush, and I can choose between the different alphas here, right? So again, now I have another tool for basically doing improvisation. So if I go into, let's just get another sphere going here. Drive Ara crazy with the sphere with the pole. And then I'm going to go down here to geometry, and let's just say, let's do make polymesh, blah, blah, blah. And then dynamesh, I don't know, let's do 512. And now I could just drag these out, and I get, okay, it does look kind of like cyber boobs, but it's Geiger, man, what do you want? Yeah, I was a weirdo. And if I hold the Alt key, they can you know, do this kind of stuff. So you could just go to town with this kind of stuff. So, you know, you build up these libraries, and then making a composition, you know, something like the one that I had before. This thing is pretty straightforward because I could just sit there and play around with, you know, get my geometry, place the head in there, and then start kit bashing, basically, with all these different alpha. So I'm doing kit bashing not only with geometry, but also with some of the alpha brushes that I've used. This, by the way, is rendered in Octane. I currently work for the people who make Octane, so I got to plug them. So Otoy makes Octane. It's my current favorite renderer, although I use all different types of renderers, and I like to experiment with different ones, but I find that Octane, if you get enough graphics cards, it's nice and fast, and it's great for basically look development, because since it's GPU based, it's very fast and it starts to resolve very quickly while you're working. They all kind of do in different ways. I think the nice thing, and Steve said this before, there's so many different renderers to choose from that you can almost find a different renderer for your various different moods when you're working, which I think is kind of cool. The other thing that I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of new features, so that thing's kind of cool. So you can see this is where I kind of went to town with this kind of waffle effect by taking advantage of the faceting in the geometry, masking it, and then hitting it with the inflate brush to get this kind of wild kind of stuff. And when you render this kind of thing, it looks really nice when it picks up the light. But another feature that I've been playing with a lot that I really like in ZBrush 4 R8. Let's see if I can use, what is this thing? Let's use the old gear. This is the gear primitive, so I'm just going to go down to initialize and just play with it real quick. Just create some kind of cool mechanical looking deal. Is that a question?
Yeah. Is there any way you can load in a vector displacement from like a third-party program into ZBrush and create the chisel brush?
Is there a third-party program to do what?
Can you load in a third-party vector displacement and create the chisel brush?
I haven't tried that yet, but what I suspect, since from what I understand of the way that the brush works, when you convert it into the geometry into the brush, it has to be that flat plane, right? So let's say you had a three-dimensional object that you really liked. I haven't tried this, but I've thought about it. What you could do is you could bring in that flat plane, bring in your 3D object, import it into ZBrush as a subtool, and then maybe use like projection to sort of wrap the plane around the parts of the geometry that you like, and then convert that into a brush. That might be overthinking it, but it should work. But yeah, I haven't tried doing the technique that you're thinking of, and I'd have to talk to Paul and see what are the limitations in terms of converting the geometry into the brush, and see if there's some wiggle room on that. But that's the way that I would try doing it. I believe it's creating some type of vector alpha, but it's a little bit beyond my understanding in terms of the technical aspects of it. But I'm just going to make, let's say I create some kind of piece of geometry like this, and then, what I'll usually do is, again, I'm going to use the array mesh, but sometimes what I'll do, if I'm going to make a whole lot of these using the array mesh, is I'll take the Z modeler and just really quickly go in here and maybe delete some of the unnecessary edges. I'm sure there's other fast ways to do this, but I'm just going to go into, I've got the Z modeler brush. I'm going to go to the edge actions, hit delete, and do edge loop complete, and just go in here and just delete a few edges, just to get the polygon count down to something so I'm not wasting geometry. Because if I duplicate this a lot, I don't need to add, more thousands of polygons that aren't really being used for anything. All right, so I'll probably go do something like that and just bring it down, maybe some of the other stuff in the interior, but you get the idea. So what I'll do now is I'm going to make this just a little bit thicker. And then I'll go into geometry, array mesh, and hit array mesh. And this time I'm just going to do this really simply. Do an offset along the y-axis. And, okay, maybe not the y-axis. Let's do, yeah, I have this aligned around this axis. So let's bring this down to something like that. Let's scale it. It's kind of like, it's using the Z profile, but I think that's kind of cool. I don't know. Like I said, I'm fooling around here. So let's say I get something like that. I could even have some fun and do a little spiral or something. I don't know. Really, what I'm trying to do is I just want to get some kind of sort of mechanical repeating action here. And then I'm going to turn off extrude and hit make mesh. And then what I'm going to do for creating things like these guys right here, you know, I spent some time, let's see if I can zoom in on this, yes. Okay, so I spent some time modeling kind of like an interesting shape here. Then I used array mesh to kind of duplicate these over and over. And then when I went to placing these, it's the same with right here, you know, I've done it before where I've actually just converted a single piece of geometry into an insert mesh brush and then turned that into a curve brush. But if you guys have played with the curve brush, you know sometimes it's a little bit frustrating to use. So a new technique that is a little bit more fun is to use one of the deformers. And I'm a big fan of the deformers. I like the bend curve a lot. Basically, the way this works is I'm going to use a curve to actually twist and bend this thing. So you have to sort of understand and play with these settings a little bit to figure out what's going on. The first thing I want to do is right now the curve is going across this axis right here, which is the x-axis. I want it to go along the z-axis. So this little cone right here, you can see has a little message there that's saying 1 is x, 2 is y, and 3 is z. So right now it's in the 1 position. If I pull it out, you see it turns green. That's the y position. If I pull it out again, that's the z position. So now I have 2 dots here. And the next thing I want to do is maybe change the resolution of the curve. So if I start to pull this up, it adds more dots to the curve. And now I can start to move these dots around. And I can start to kind of play with bending it around my surface. And we also have this little cone here that can control the smoothness. We can actually, I'm going to leave symmetry off for the moment. We also have this type of, then we can actually control the twisting around individual points. So again, this is just something that I've been starting to play with, but you can see it's a lot easier to use than making an insert mesh brush and making that into a curve, because it's also non-destructive too. And it's very easy to reset, or I can even change the resolution, say while I'm working on it, without changing the shape here. So now I could add some more points, or even reduce the points without changing the shape. And make it a little bit easier to use with lower shapes. So that's kind of a cool technique, you know, by combining array mesh with the primitives and the curve deformer, you get some cool stuff going. So let me see, I'm going to load the girl here. Let's see. What I usually do, you know, depending on how much time I have, if I'm just sort of improvising an image or something like that that I want to do in a cool render, what I might do is, for this particular one, and I just did this kind of like on Saturday afternoon. So I had a base mesh of the face, which I made her smiling. I went in here with one of my alphas, This is a part that I think I'm still working on because I think she came out a little bit, the detail is too much, so especially in the render, it just kind of looks like noise. So I'm probably going to go back and change some of this detail right here just to make it look a little bit more obvious that there's a pattern there. If you look in the actual render, you can see I went a little bit too far with the texture here, so now it looks like noise, and I've lost all the cool kind of patterns to it. So I'm just going to go back and maybe touch that up a little bit and make it look a little bit more obvious as to what's going on. In the sculpt, especially in the neck, it looks pretty good, right? Like I like this detail right here. It's just basically I exported this, brought it into Substance Painter, and then got a little carried away. So really it's just a matter of going back and fixing the textures and making sure that they really emphasize the forms rather than just too much detail. But basically, just kind of a lot of the detail that was created on her head was using the alphas and just really kind of quickly sketching and doodling to come up with something that was kind of cool. But you can also see the techniques that I used for these little tubey things back here in the background. In some cases, like this is actually a curve brush, which worked okay. So this technique for these curves right here, I created an insert mesh brush from a piece of geometry, made that a curve, and then laid that out, and realized that that was no fun. So I tried instead, for the second larger curves back here, I again created some geometry, used the array mesh to make like a long column of it, and then used that new curve deformer to kind of position it into space. And I found that was much easier to use, much easier to control than the curve brush, so I kind of really like that. And then, you know, some of the stuff in the background, I kind of knew in the render, I just wanted something to suggest detail in the background. So this is just one of those weird, goofy things that I improvised, you know, in my little morning sketch routine. I just kind of threw it in there and to see if it would work. And it worked pretty well. Again, if I decide to redo the render where I can see more of her, I might go back and touch it up. But for the moment, it's doing what it needs to do, which is just providing background. And then for these little lamp things, again, it's the same technique. I use the curve deformer to kind of position this and make a little bit of geometry there. And for this thing right here, originally I had just kind of like a nice disc to create the halo and to hold the light in here, but it was looking a little bit boring. So I created, if I select this, I had this polygrouped, and I essentially created an insert mesh brush out of this weird little spikety nipple thing, and converted that into a nano mesh, and then used the nano mesh to insert kind of repeating form on all these polygons. Does that make sense, or am I talking gibberish? Sometimes you get into ZBrush land. Say what? Both? Yeah, well, you can blame Pixelogic for that. Sometimes I have a theory that they basically, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for saying this, that when they're coming up for the terminology in the newer versions of ZBrush, they just have some like freaked out little kid that's on like way too much caffeine somewhere in the basement. They just open a door, it's like, what should we call this? It's like Dynamesh. It's like, all right, call it Dynamesh. You know. Anyways. A question? Okay, go ahead.
Did you use radial symmetry on while inserting those details on the halo?
Did I use a what?
Radial symmetry.
For this one, you know, I tried that for about 5 minutes, and then, you know, for the details on the actual geometry itself, yeah, what I did is I took a really simple cylinder primitive, and then converted it into a poly mesh, and then we used, I think for this one, yeah, I probably did use radial symmetry. But, you know, the nice thing about using the Z modeler brush is if I have, you know, if I have these, like if I have this as, I'm going to set this to polygroup as the action, right? And I'm going to actually turn off symmetry. So I'm going to turn this to polygroup as my face action, and then I could do polygroup, use polyloop as the actual where it's going to perform the action, and then I could set this to checker, right? And then as you can see, as I'm hovering over the polygon, you see that little orange line?
Yeah.
That's telling the direction of where it's going. So if it's going this way and I click, you can see now I have this polygroup which is alternating yellow and green. So now what I could do is I'll go back to QMesh and say polygroup all, and it's just going to QMesh the green polygons, right? So I just kind of created these kind of extrusions using that kind of technique. And then what I did is, and this is all kind of just making it up as I go along, I created this very simple geometry here, right? Yeah. Converted it into an insert mesh brush by going to brush, create insert mesh brush. And then I converted that insert mesh brush into a nano mesh brush. I gotta find that 8-year-old kid. Nano mesh! Created a nano mesh brush, made sure that I had a polygroup on each of these faces. And I probably did something stupid like had to go in and polygroup each of those individually because I was making it up as I went along. But then basically I did a nano mesh on that, and I didn't even have to use radial symmetry. So, but you could do it with radial symmetry as well. Either way works just fine. But I just did that on this side and this side because I just really wanted something to, catch the light in the render and make it look like there's some nice detail going on here. Again, this is kind of like a work in progress, so I'll probably go back and play with this a little bit more. There's a certain point where, you start to get too much detail and everything looks like noise and there's nothing for the eye to land on. Like this right here came out as a completely unintentional happy accident just in terms of the shader that I was using that in Octane and how it interacted with this really simple geometry right here. But it does kind of like, it reminds me in the render a little bit of our friend the Xenomorph, maybe his head or something like that. That kind of thing. I might go back in there and start playing with the shaders and make it look a little bit more complex, but if I start to put too much detail in there, it'll start to look less interesting. I mean, it's nice to have the contrast with kind of smooth, low detail with kind of jagged, high detail, kind of alternating like that. So we'll see. For a lot of these, like I spent a lot of time texturing her face and probably too much time texturing her neck, but a lot of the other details you see here is just basically like procedural shaders using Octane. So I might go back and start to texture them a little bit. Depends on how excited I am about UVing some of this crazy ass geometry. I could say crazy ass, right? Oh, it's too late now. Cool. Any questions? Other questions? Yes.
How did you prepare the sweat? Did you go into substance, or did you?
The sweat was obnoxiously easy. All I did was I painted little drippy masks on her face, and I used a mesh extraction. So that's very old school ZBrush, I think the mask is still on there. So I just painted the mask on here. I went down here, did an extraction. Oh, I gotta turn off solo. Did an extraction, accepted it, hit it with a smooth brush once it was geometry, converted it into geometry. So this is what it looks like right here. Hit it with the smooth brush, exported it with its horrible topology, but it didn't really bother me that this is what the topology looks like. And then put it on her face in Maya and rendered with Octane with Maya with just a specular material on it. It's something that I'm probably doing too much, but it works, so I'm going to keep doing it. It's kind of like depth of field. Like depth of field is one of the best ways to get a client to love whatever you're doing, even if it's crappy, because people just love it. It gives this mystical kind of quality to things. This is my website, by the way. So my new thing is to abuse water drops as much as possible. So for example, I have this spider that I'm working on. And when I first, so this is an orb weaver spider. By the way, if you guys want to meet these guys in person, the Spider Pavilion at the Natural History Museum starts up in September, and you can go in there, and they're like right there. They're not behind anything, man. You could walk right into them. But they're very friendly spiders. They just look evil. But in any case, so again, I just put some like simple geometry on here through a specular material on Octane and rendered it with some depth of field, and it made an otherwise kind of like ho-hum render of a spider suddenly look kind of alive. So it's a really cheap technique, but it works like gangbusters because instead of just being a spider in a web, now we kind of have a story. We kind of know what time of day it is and that kind of thing. And if the spider is thirsty or not, I don't know. That's the story of this spider. It's a thirsty spider. But it's something that I've been doing lately, and it works pretty well. These are some of the renders of some of the other like just experiments and sketches that I did in ZBrush, just rendered really quickly in Octane with different shaders on it, just to kind of experiment with some of these ideas.
Eric, quick question. You're taking your stuff from ZBrush to Maya for Octane. Is it the high poly?
I usually, if I'm feeling lazy, I will do a decimation master, and I'll get it down. The ZBrush, Octane has a very high tolerance for high polygons, but still, since I'm bringing it into Maya, I might cut it down to like, between 150,000 to 1,000,000 polygons, depending on what I'm rendering. Sometimes that does tend to soften the details a little bit too much. Octane does have really excellent displacement, like micro displacement maps. I just use that when I have time to actually do some UVing. So, again, it's like one of these things where we're in a great time to be a CG artist because it's so much easier to experiment and to not worry about failing, as opposed to like when we were starting, 10, 15 years ago, where, you really had to make sure everything was solid before you could even bring it into your CG package and render it. You didn't have as much freedom to bring in a 2 million polygon model, hit render, and just see what happens, So that's kind of the nice thing about the way the technology is going. These are some other renders that I've been doing recently that this is a little bit more thought out, but still kind of fun. Kind of combining my love for invertebrate zoology with sort of a Geiger kind of quality to it. And again, these are like, all these models are something that I just kind of played with, not really with anything particular in mind, for about, like 30, 40 minutes or something like that. So I consider it to be similar to, a sketchbook kind of thing, you know what I mean? So that's that. And of course, if you like bugs, I have those too. This is another earlier one that I did, nice and juicy. And then this is one, a little bit more thought out, where I was thinking, this is something I actually did as a part of a demo for my creature class. The assignment was to come up with a pair of alien creatures that had some kind of relationship with each other, whether it's parasitic, symbiotic, sexual dimorphism or whatever. So the story behind this creature is this is very romantic actually. This blue thing is the male and this pink thing is the female, and they live in a stream, and she uses her little hooks here, her lovely little hooks, to kind of grab onto twigs. So as the water is rushing by, let me see if I can get a good picture. Okay, so she's hooked onto the twigs here, and as the water's rushing by, these little filter things, they pick up the particles of food, and that's how she eats. Meanwhile, the man of the house, this thing, is kind of clamped onto her belly, and this thing is inserted inside her and delivers a package of little babies, which turn into eggs, and then she releases them into the stream. Just a goofy little concept for the kind of like demonstrating using sort of a biological principle as a story within a creature kind of thing. But again, super fast, kind of fun sculpting things without worrying too much about any particular direction. Does that make sense? Cool.
Eric, one of our live stream viewers would like to know if you ever use Keyshot to render.
Yeah, I do. I like Keyshot too. I think some of these older ones are Keyshot render. This is another. There we go. There's a Keyshot render of a wolf spider and her babies. This is I did for Mother's Day. No, I didn't. came out pretty well. I'm not totally happy with it. I kind of like Octane a little bit better, but I also know Octane really well. So, and also since I'm a Maya artist, I tend to, like a lot of, this is an Octane render. This is a Drosophila melanogaster. It tends to render paint effects really well if it's like simple hair stuff. And so I kind of like it a little bit better than Keyshot. The downside of using it is I can't just click a button and send it over to Keyshot and have everything render with Polypaint. I do have to spend some time really working on the textures and the UVs and all that kind of stuff. So it's not as instant as Keyshot, but I like the way the renders look a little bit better than Keyshot. But that might be an issue of me just not spending enough time in Keyshot. But this is one that I like, which is a Mexican honey wasp. So that's Octane render. This, by the way, is an actual insect. My friend Alex Wild sent me some dead specimens of this thing. This is the only wasp that actually makes honey. The only other animal that makes honey that we know of is, of course, honeybees. So it's kind of cool. It's a cute little critter. So I thought that was really cool. I'm just going off on tangents now, but does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Keyshot's good. I like Keyshot.
Do you have any more last questions in the stage? Last chance? No?
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for listening to
Yeah.
me and let me ramble on aimlessly.
Round of
I hope you picked up
applause.
some cool ideas.
Eric, your work is insane, as always. I love it. Yeah, thank you so much, all of today's speakers. So Ara, Steve, Eric. So great to see so many different styles and different approaches as well. And thank you everyone for joining us too. It's been a long night. I know everyone wants to get home. So we'll crack on with the raffle. Before we do, if this is your first Gnomon event, you can find out about more upcoming events at gnomon.edu/events. And you can watch all of our past events, most of them, at livestream.com/Gnomon as well. Next week on the 24th, we'll have some lead artists from Insomniac Games, so the guys working on the new Spider-Man game. And that'll be a moderated panel, so it's going to be really fun. So come along to that. We'll do a campus tour. I think a couple people signed up for a tour. If you're still down to do that, we are too. If not, we can arrange for you to come back another day. So yes, let's get on with the prizes. Courtney, well, there you are. We have quite a few prizes, so we only have one microphone.
All right, hi everyone. I'd like to announce our winner on live stream who shared our link on Twitter. Daniel Arbuckle, congratulations. You're our winner of a 1-month subscription to the Gnomon Workshop. That's Daniel Arbuckle, Twitter handle Dan Arbuckle Art. If you can send us an email to events@gnomon.edu, we can get you hooked up with that tomorrow. All right. So, our first prize of tonight. Okay, we're going to start with the portfolio review for 1 hour with Eric Keller.
We're now on to the ZBrush lesson.
I'm sorry, the ZBrush lesson, yes. Getting confused. So
Their
again, we
portfolio
have
might look better than mine, so I don't want to review it. You know?
the 1 hour, ZBrush lesson with Eric. And, okay, I have 027677. All right, yes. If you want to come up here and just wait along the side. And I'll take your raffle ticket. Sure, if you like. That would be fine. Okay. Thank you. Let me just check it real quick. Yes,
Seems like it should be
correct.
Steve's.
All right, so just hang tight. Okay, so portfolio review with Steve, 027675. Yay, awesome. If you can just bring me your ticket, and then we'll go ahead and just have you wait over here. Okay, and here. Thank Thank you. All right, we have a match. Okay, so the portfolio review with Ara will be 027643. 027643. Okay, we're going to pick again. Okay. 027629. Excellent. Congratulations. I'll just take the ticket, and then if you want to wait over with the guys. Thank you. All right. Whichever.
Let's do the big one.
All right. Next, we're going to do our big print from Ara. Let me make sure I stay on camera here. Thank you. Much else, Lovey. All right. 027670. No? 027670. All right. Next number. Here, I'll take it. Everyone seen it? Ooh. Thank you. 027663. 027663. All right, next. 027616. Congrats. Yes, correct. All right. So next we have some really awesome t-shirt and print combos here. So we have a few different t-shirts. And so each of our 3 winners for these will get 1 t-shirt and 1 print. Okay, so 027667. Awesome. 027652. Thank you. Yes, awesome. And 027664. Awesome. Yay. Anyone? 027664. Okay, one more. Yes. Thank you. 027642. 642? 027630. Excellent. I'll take your ticket. Thank you. Okay, and we'll get you guys hooked up with your prizes in just a moment, but we're going to, this is the DIY? Okay, so we have one of Steve's awesome sketchbots. This is the DIY variant. And you have to customize it. You have to upload a picture. You have to tag Steve so we can see it. 027628. Yay! Thank you. All right, 628. Here's your sketchbot. And 027638. Excellent. 638. Excellent. All right. That is all of our prizes for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, for your patience with all these raffles, and our wonderful presenters for all of these amazing prizes. He's just not in the box right now because he was a little display.